Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a pretty fascinating journey from the high-level halls of educational policy all the way down to the ground-level reality of a student's desk. We're demystifying American reading education to see exactly how big, bureaucratic ideas turn into dynamic classroom action.
Okay, let's dive into this, because it's arguably one of the most critical challenges in education right now. How do we actually teach students to navigate a world of incredibly complex information? Well, the answer lies in a highly structured, surprisingly engaging system of frameworks and standards that build on each other year after year.
So here's our roadmap. We'll quickly cover the reading framework revolution, how we balance literature with informational text, core cognitive targets, and building evidence-based arguments. Then we'll dive right into an American Dream case study, and finally look at creating tomorrow's critical thinkers. Section 1, the Reading Framework Revolution, the blueprint for critical thinkers. We often think of national standards as these dry, lifeless documents, but they're actually a cohesive blueprint for building critical, analytical minds. You might see acronyms like NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the Common Core State Standards, and wonder, well, so what? The so what is that these high-level frameworks directly shape the complex instruction happening every single day. They are literally the rulebooks dictating what happens at a student's desk, defining reading as a dynamic, cognitive process rather than just passive absorption.
Section 2. Balancing literature and information, preparing for the adult world. Now, what's really interesting here is the dramatic shift in what students are actually reading as they grow up. In grade 4, you see a perfect 50-50 split between literary and informational texts. But look at grade 12. It shifts heavily to 30% literature and a massive 70% informational text. The framework intentionally ramps up exposure to history, science, and technical documents to match the real-world demands of college and careers.
And we see the exact same evolution in writing expectations. In elementary school, conveying a personal or imagined experience, basically storytelling, is a major focus at 35%. But by 12th grade, those training wheels come off. Conveying experience drops to just 20%, forcing high schoolers to focus overwhelmingly on writing to persuade and explain. It's a very deliberate pivot toward complex argument and analysis.
Section 3. Core Cognitive Reading Targets, the mental processes.
So what exactly is happening inside a student's head? The NAEP framework breaks this down into a clear progression of 3 steps. Step 1 is locate and recall, just finding explicitly stated ideas. Step 2 gets a bit harder. Integrate and interpret, where students have to make comparisons and examine relationships across the whole text. And finally, step 3 is critique and evaluate. This is where students must view a text critically from numerous perspectives and judge its overall quality. They're moving from simply remembering facts to actively dissecting them.
Section 4. Building evidence-based arguments, the standards in action.
To see how these cognitive targets are enforced, we turn to the Common Core. I know, these dense grids look incredibly intimidating. It's enough to make anyone's eyes glaze over. But this brilliantly illustrates just how structured the progression of skills actually is. For instance, in 6th grade, a student might just cite basic textual evidence. But by 8th grade, they must cite the evidence that most strongly supports an analysis. The standard literally grows and deepens right along with the student.
Let's look closely at Standard 8. It requires students to delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, assessing whether the reasoning is sound and the evidence is relevant. So what does that actually mean for the learner? In other words, students learn how to spot a weak argument and call it out. They're trained to demand proof and to immediately recognize irrelevant information.
Section 5. Case Study, American Dream, Ground-Level Classroom Application. All right. Let's step out of the policy documents and into the classroom with a Library of Congress lesson plan. This isn't some boring lecture. It's a highly dynamic role play. Students are broken into teams and assigned specific roles to research the American dream. One student acts as a photographer analyzing images, another as a lawyer, a poet, a politician, a producer, a comedian finding irony, a musician, or even a reporter. They have to adopt these totally diverse perspectives to synthesize a century of history.
Just imagine being an 8th or 11th grader handed this task. You must search and sift through rare print documents, early motion pictures, and historical recorded sounds directly from the Library of Congress digital archives. Your goal? To define the American dream and build a cohesive narrative based entirely on primary sources. It is rigorous, hands-on historical inquiry.
Let's zoom in on just one of those roles for a second. the lawyer. The student assigned this role has to prepare a legal brief about the status of the American dream, defending their argument with the primary source evidence they've gathered from the archives. So the crucial point is how perfectly this maps back to that Common Core standard we just looked at. The student is evaluating claims, checking reasoning, and presenting relevant evidence in a real-world, high-stakes format.
Section 6. Creating Tomorrow's Critical Thinkers, the End Result.
When you take high-level frameworks and apply them through immersive lessons, the result is pretty profound. Listen to this powerful quote submitted by a 12th grade student to the Library of Congress's Wall of Dreams project after completing this kind of rigorous analysis. They wrote, "I wish to be actively involved in history, a living history that will affect every person, to make our nation a more thoughtful nation and our people more thoughtful people. That is my American dream." Mastering these reading frameworks isn't just about passing tests. It yields incredibly thoughtful, self-aware, and critically engaged citizens.
So, think back to your own time in school. How does your education stack up against today's rigorous standards for critical thinking and evidence-based argumentation? It's genuinely fascinating to consider just how much the architecture of learning has evolved and how it continues to shape the minds of the future.